Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's edition of Scholars Who Teach, the faculty showcase portion of our admitted student programming. My name is Topher Bordeaux, and I'm an associate director of admissions at the college, and I'm pleased that so many people could join us this evening. As you are no doubt aware of by now, one of the distinguishing aspects of a Dartmouth education is the access that students have to faculty who are both leading scholars in their fields and also teachers and mentors in your classes. So every Monday through Thursday night over the month of April, my colleagues and I will introduce you to a few of the people who embody that scholar-teacher model. Tonight, we're joined by Professor Alexander Chi, an associate professor of English and creative writing. And Professor Chi will share a bit about how studying fiction writing and personal narrative can teach students to connect more deeply with their own ideas. Speaking of experts in their fields, I should note that Professor Chi was just very recently honored with a Guggenheim Fellowship. So we're especially pleased that he can be here this evening. Before I turn things over to Professor Chi, I will encourage everybody to drop any questions that they might have into the Q&A right as you think of them over the course of the session. We will leave some time at the end to answer as many as we can. And with that, I will turn things over to the professor.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who have come this evening. I'm happy to talk to you about one of my favorite subjects, which is creative writing. I would say, I started out as a writer in high school. And at the same time, it took me a long time to also admit that that was what I was doing, which is sort of strange, by which I mean, everyone was always telling me to go and be a writer. And I am a little bit of a contrarian, which is to say that if you tell me to do something, I will do the other thing. So I spent a good deal of amount of time in college studying visual art and telling anyone who asked that I was going to be a visual artist. That story is something that I think it wasn't a mistake that I was doing that. I think it was, in fact, something that ended up making me a better writer. Something that I have, for example, learned over the years is that drawing something is a great way to remember it and a great way to take notes about it. And I have since used some of the exercises that I learned in that studio art class in my studio writing classes, which is a way that I would encourage you to think about the studying of creative writing as a kind of studio art class. The studio art model for studying writing is one that I think is useful to students, whether you decide to be a professional writer or not. I have had some of my most talented writing students go on to be neurosurgeons, lawyers for the Army. Some of them are working with the web. For some reason, poets are also very good at the internet. I'm not really sure what that's about. You'll surprise yourself, I think, as you learn to write. And I think that's partly because one of the first things that you learn when you try to write a short story for the first time is that it is very hard to tell a story that you do not want to tell. And in the process of learning how to write the story, you learn what actually matters to you. I've taught writing for about 25 years at this point. I first started teaching writing in 1996 in New York City at an outfit called the Gotham Writers Workshop. It's the kind of job that you get after your first graduate degree that a lot of people who teach writing have had. I think they might still pay the same as what they paid me back then. It was a terrific class, though, because I could not reject any of the students. I had to take whoever came into the class. And there was a certain humility that I learned in the process of teaching those kinds of students. One of my favorite lessons from that time came when I had written on the back of a student's essay, their sort of writing exercise response. I wrote, "I don't recommend revising this," because I didn't really think much of what he had produced. And then he turned in this incredible revision, a story that really blew me away. And when I spoke to him about it, he thought I had written, "I really recommend that you revise this." My handwriting is not so great. Um, that was one of the significant lessons to my early teaching life, the teaching writing, because I saw how, in some ways, enthusiasm was something that mattered a lot at the drafting phase of things, where a piece of writing could go any number of ways. And the idea itself was mutable, changeable, and prone to uh, all kinds of experiments. And I think the thing that I learned about my role as a teacher was that I was there to try to expand the student's idea of how one approached an idea, to give them a combination of habits of mind, uh, methodologies, ways of approaching the subject in question, um, and and then to just kind of help them by mirroring back to them what they were doing and asking them, is that what they wanted to be doing? All of the rest of it has proved to be pretty fungible, changeable. I've seen the way creative writing is taught change a great deal. Some of you may be um, using some of those ideas even now. The newer ideas, that is, because I think uh, creative writing has become really popular in high school in a way that it just wasn't when I was a student. So I frequently am surprised to have students who are already pretty experienced writers, and that is always exciting to me. Those of you who are trying to study creative writing at the college level may sometimes get questions from people in your life about what you might do with creative writing. And that is part of why I try to talk to my students as much as I can about what I'm actually doing. So, for example, uh, last year, I spent much of the year working on a variety of special assignments for different sections of the New York Times. One was an essay about COVID and the AIDS epidemic, parallels between them, something that I wrote for a special section of the Times that was published around Pride. I also worked on an essay about Korea at the end of World War II for the anniversary of the end of World War II this last summer. And that proved to be a rather profound, both essays were very profound for me personally, but the Guggenheim that I got because I worked on that project and had an idea for a book that I then applied to the Guggenheim with. It was my great pleasure to work with one of my former students, Betty Kim, who is a formidable young writer herself, as well as a cartoonist. And she was my researcher in this effort, and also a translator. Um, and I was able to get her first byline in the New York Times in the process. And that is kind of my favorite kind of mentoring, where I am working with students in a way that both gives them a kind of inside view of what I'm doing as a writer with research, how I conduct my research, what I need, what I don't need, um, how I find the stories that I'm looking for, and then also introducing them to people professionally, creating opportunities for them as well in the process. The sorts of classes that I teach here at Dartmouth right now, I teach a speculative fiction course that's pretty popular called Imaginary Countries. I teach fiction writing, and I teach the essay as well, nonfiction writing. And then I teach what are called first year seminars, which if you decide to matriculate with us, you will be choosing from next year. And that one that I offer is called Literature of the Displaced. And it's a course that looks at the literature that is most recently being produced out of the experience of migration. It's taught as a creative writing course of a kind, which is sort of flexibility that the college offers, and it is a nonfiction course in particular. The scholar teacher model for me as a creative writer involves a couple of things: teaching the best of what I learned as a writing student, teaching what I myself have had to teach myself, and then teaching the best of what I am still learning as a writer and as a teacher of writing. I think the process of moving forward this way is the only kind of honest way that I can think of to do this kind of work. And I teach in a spirit of inquiry. I teach courses with the idea that we are collectively looking for answers together to questions that I introduce usually at the beginning of the course, but that also come up in the process of what we're reading. I think of writing classes as being a way of experiencing many more writing problems than you've already had through the problems that other people are having with their writing. And in the process, learning what their solutions are and their problems are, so that when you yourself finally encounter them, you have a larger arsenal than just your own personal experience to take on whatever these challenges are. Fiction writing is a funny thing to teach. The thing that I love about it is always watching people encounter their imaginations and what's possible on the page for the first time, as well as they grow, guiding them through larger and larger challenges. I've taught writing long enough at this point that I have a number of students that I like to brag about a little bit. My students jokingly call this a flex. So I will flex very lightly and say some of the writers that I have been lucky enough to have studied with me include Ayanna Mathis, Carmen Machado, Angela Flournoy, Morgan Jenkins, Stan Parrish, and Nicholas Mancusi, just to name a few off the top of my head. Asia Gabel is another one who recently published a novel that may be familiar to those of you who love music. And I think, something that I've been able to see over time is that it is very hard for me to tell which of these students will definitely become a writer and which of these students will not. And that in a sense, at this level, at the undergraduate level, the best way that I can teach is to teach not as if it doesn't matter exactly, but to teach in a way that makes the class as valuable to someone who might never go on to be a fiction writer to someone who will definitely go on to be a fiction writer. Some things that you learn in the process of trying to write fiction are imagination in response to problems, learning to set yourself aside and what that means, as well as how to differently center yourself and your concerns. I think the some of the things that I've seen students learn that they found valuable also include, the teaching of empathy is considered to be a little not subjective exactly, but it's funny to me that it's a little devalued right now in the current discourse, because I feel like we need it a great deal. But I think the thing that you're doing when you are writing fiction is you're not changing the names on your memories. You're not uh, you're not creating some sort of backdoor scandal uh, to lightly disguised uh, for the snickering of those who know. You're doing something that takes what you've lived through and makes it into something that you can share with others, such that anyone who comes across it might be able to find something that they didn't know, or something that they will dearly value in the process. And that kind of openness, I think, requires a certain spiritual openness, if you will, to the idea that you don't know what will happen as a result of writing something. You don't know what will happen as a result of reading something. In our current culture, which can be so transactional, it can be a little scary to open yourself up to that kind of experience. And I definitely understand that. That's part of what makes it interesting to me. I also really like teaching research. One of my favorite parts of the courses that I offer here is I work with our subject librarian, Wendell Cox, who is a master of research. And I like to play a little game with him, especially in the first year writing seminar, where I ask students to think about something that they want to know in relationship to what they're writing about, but that they believe that they can't find. And then we created a challenge list for Wendell Cox, and he has never been defeated, I have to say. It's fascinating every time. Every time I teach a class, I learn things that I didn't know about the world, about American history, about life, and it's part of the fun for me. One of my favorite outcomes in recent times is there was a student who discovered the paperwork that her grandmother had used when she fled the Holocaust, and first had to immigrate to Haiti, which was accepting Jewish refugees before the United States was, and then eventually made her way to New Jersey. This paperwork that my student discovered in the process of doing an exercise where we fact-checked a family story, this allowed her grandmother to repatriate before she died, which was something that she had dearly wanted to do. Some of the outcomes are more lighthearted, I guess. I'm thinking of a student who was from Arizona, and he was trying to prove that his mother really had changed the school board, the mind of the school board in his town, so that they would allow for the celebration of Jewish holidays. And And I remember very, very clearly still the line in his essay that went something to the effect of like, while there's there's no record in the minutes of the meeting that shows that my mother spoke, it is true that after that meeting, Jewish holidays were adopted by the school district. So you get a picture of uh, the world in the process of doing the research that becomes part of the picture you present and what you're writing about. Um, right now, you're all probably in your hometowns, and you may think you know a lot about them. One of the writing exercises that I like to assign in my first year seminar is to research your hometown, because chances are you are more of a witness to that place than you are someone who really knows it, even though all of it is perhaps so overwhelmingly familiar to you in some way that you are anxious to leave. Some of the things that I ask students to look for are, what are the flora and fauna, major flora and fauna by season, for example. What are the main industries? When was the town named and founded? And when was it settled? And who lived there before? Um, the major industries, the major historical events, uh, any kind of famous buildings. These sorts of items seem at first like a kind of housekeeping, but there's a story that develops in the process that you can see into story of a place, story of the people, and eventually a story about you. Research for fiction writing in particular is also something I teach to my students because it is something that readers expect. Probably all of you have had the experience of reading a piece of fiction and coming across a fact that you are sure is wrong, either because it's part of your lived experience or it's part of your field of study or the expertise of someone you know. And there's a betrayal that you feel at the presence of that, that's real, and that is something that you might never forgive that writer for. Um, that sort of thing is is so common that it makes it a little funny when I encounter people who think that fiction writers just make it all up, which was certainly uh, it's one of the things that can be difficult for people in my field when we are applying for research funding, and some people who, let's call them a little provincial on the subject, uh, don't understand what's involved. When I was working on my second novel, The Queen of the Night, which was published in 2016, I regularly worked with a library of about 60 reference books that I used to try to map the experience of my character into a very specific part of history. In this case, the Second Empire, the fall of the Second Empire and the siege of Paris, and the beginning of the Third Republic of France. I did this as someone who did not particularly know French very well, and it was an exhaustive and taxing process. It was also incredibly fun. And every time I come near those artifacts, I feel the pull of the old story drawn in, tempted to make a revision of some kind, to add a new scene. Um, this is the kind of thing that no one's publisher wants to hear. um, you may, like me, love old things. You may hear the voices of old things, which is, I think, it's one of the ways that you know that you might be a fiction writer, for example. Um, I always loved junk shops. I always loved yard sales. I still do. I love museums, walking around them. One of the most fun research trips I took while researching that novel involved discovering that there was a display at the Museum of Fashion in Paris of the clothes of the Empress Eugenie, and she was a character in the novel, and the clothes were set up at the Museum of Fashion in Paris. It was a one-time exhibition, probably not going to be repeated, and uh, I searched for and found a $215 round trip ticket to Paris, jumped on it, went, and had an incredible time. It's true that if you write a novel set in Paris, that you do have to go to Paris a great deal. Those adventures uh, were all fun. I think, at a certain point, as the gap closed around what I didn't know but needed to know, and I started to learn what I needed to know, that taught me more about what I needed to know, which led to a few further adventures and eventually the creation of the novel. Um, I think the piece that takes me back to what I do here at the college um, is, so for example, I love bringing students into our special collections at Dartmouth, which have some extraordinary artifacts. Those are the places where you find those old things with voices in the special care of our librarians. The Rounder librarians are some of the most wonderful and intelligent people I've met. I always enjoy hearing from them. Uh, I think something that I really appreciate about Dartmouth is the spirit of collegiality between the way the people who work here uh, work together. So, for example, in my first year teaching here, I got an email from one of the Rounder librarians asking me if I wanted to see their file of Dartmouth student papers going back to the 1700s. And as soon as he mentioned it, I very much did. It was not the kind of thing that I ever expected being able to use, uh, but it was the kind of artifact, I guess you could say, that you can definitely find at Dartmouth and not too many other places. It was interesting because it became, just reading through these old essays, it became a history of how a question is answered and asked even at the college. And that was a fantastic teaching tool that year. And it's something I haven't taught that specific version of the first year seminar since, but I will be offering it at a later date. And it's certainly something that an archive that I look forward to bringing back to the classroom. The sorts of other things that we do, I've helped some students create a literary magazine. It's called Meeting House. They just launched last fall, and I taught them everything from how to fundraise and create an editorial board, to solicit for submissions, how to handle the social media related to it, um, how to launch the magazine, the kinds of events that you could do during COVID, and how the magazine might set itself apart. Excuse me. One of the things that we did that I was especially proud of was the magazine had 3 different launch readings for the fiction, nonfiction, and poetry that was represented inside of the first issue. It is entirely student run, which is to say, like, I don't make decisions about what goes in the magazine. I just guide them to the answers they need and guide them to the questions that they need to ask, which is more or less what I do in general as a teacher. We have a terrific reading series here at the college also for creative writing. It's named for Cleopatra Mathis, who was an important poet to the creation of creative writing at Dartmouth. And she just retired a few years ago. You may see her around periodically. She's still much beloved. And I think the sort of way in which the people who helped to create this legacy that we are all living and teaching with now, the way that they are still a part of the life of the college is something that I have come to really value, whether it is receiving emails from alumni who write to me after I publish something, or whether it is hearing from a former president congratulating me on getting a Guggenheim, or whether it is just seeing an alum sitting happily on the lawn in front of Sanborn, which is our Sanborn library. It's a browsing library. It's one of the sort of most loved parts of the college, I would say. It's also the home of the English department, English and creative writing. And it's a beautiful triple height ceiling library with catwalks and reading nooks on the side, and books that you can only read in the library. You can't check them out. And a library of literary magazines also. It is easily one of the most picturesque and idyllic places I can think of, and I pinch myself when I walk through because I just feel incredibly lucky to be there. And that is, I think, something that a lot of my colleagues feel about our life and work here, the home that we've made for our careers at this school. I'm happy to take questions from you. I see a few here now. Let's see. B. Sontag, are fiction writing and essay writing taught separately at Dartmouth, or are they both taught under the umbrella of a more general creative writing course? Well, let's see. So we have one of the best journalists and essayists in the country by the name of Jeff Charlotte, who is teaching here at Dartmouth. And he is sort of, I would say, the head of what happens in nonfiction writing. He and I and Peter Orner, who's another colleague of mine, Peter and I are both fiction writers and essayists. Jeff is a journalist and an essayist. And Jeff teaches a fantastic course called 40 Towns, which is a journalism course. You do investigative reporting in 40 of the towns around Dartmouth. Basically, you choose your own town, as it were. But it's done within a context where you start to, over time, see the stories that the other students have written before you as a part of the work that you're doing. It's a kind of living anthology as a class, and it's a fascinating idea. I've thought of trying to do something like it, but in fiction writing. So I would say fiction writing and creative nonfiction, as it's called, are taught as a part of that. First year seminars are courses of a variety of kinds, and that is a different kind of essay writing. And is taught by the Institute of Writing and Rhetoric. Let's see. Are there any pieces of literature that have been particularly formative in your own development as a writer? Yes. So let's see. I would say probably one of the most important books for my early years was Marguerite Duras' novel, The Lover. Also Margaret Atwood's novel, Cat's Eye. And James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, as well as his novels, Giovanni's Room and Go Tell It on the Mountain, which has become increasingly a novel that I love to teach. Yeah, I think probably those. How has your education in visual art and creative writing affected your journalistic writing? Well, there was a really interesting exercise we did in my drawing class at Wesleyan, which involved taking a series of figure studies that we had done at different times in the course and combining them into a single fictional tableau, which is to say, to make a drawing of something that hadn't existed at the time that we were drawing it. And that single exercise actually is something that I have then been able to use as a writer and as a teacher to teach people how to write fiction, which is to say, to take three memories that might not have an obvious relationship to each other, to write them down in a certain amount of detail, and then to try to turn them into story where the context for those scenes is completely different. But I think in a larger way, as I said, learning to draw as a way to remember something, to study it, to take notes about it, that certainly was profoundly important. And it's become also true that I think a lot about visual storytelling in writing. What are the gestures a character is performing on the page that tell about what they're feeling in a way that what they're saying or what the narration is describing doesn't describe as well. Let's see. Do you think that nearly all of the humanities lend themselves to improvement in one's creative writing due to a writer learning more about the world and how to examine the world? I mean, I think that path is there if you want it. Many writers, for example, start out as anthropology majors, sociology majors, or psychology. I guess the social sciences aren't technically the humanities in quite the same way. It's true that there are a certain number of competent folks who stop writing fiction, at least, because they sort of deconstruct everything too much as they write it. But some of them have gone on to become really fascinating writers of fiction or nonfiction both. What's the best way to prepare for a creative writing course at Dartmouth? Any book recommendations or tips for getting into the flow of fiction writing? Well, I mean, the great thing is let's see. There have been some books that are been published this year, in particular in relationship to creative writing, that we didn't have before. One of them is by a writer by the name of Matthew Salesses, and it's called Craft in the Real World. It just came out this year, actually. I think that is probably a terrific and profound addition to the books that we have about writing. I also highly recommend Vivian Gornick. Her book, I always get the title a little wrong, I rearrange it. Situation and the Story is a terrific book about narrative nonfiction. William Zinzer's books about writing are always, and those are classics. You may have already found them in high school, but if you haven't, I would say Reading to Learn is a classic of the genre. As for tips for getting into the flow of fiction writing, I think I'm always helped by doing a kind of writing that feels more casual, where I act as if I'm not doing anything particularly important. And it lets me write in a different kind of way than if I sit down and tell myself, and now I will write the novel, which can freeze me up. So it's a sort of a certain casualness to the way that I sneak in, I guess. I also really find it very helpful for myself to be a little anonymous, to be someplace where um, I'm not known and where no one would think to go looking for me, which sounds a little weird, but um, uh, when it was safer, that meant things like trains, cafes, libraries. Um, I I think one of my favorite places, for example, is the upstairs of Rauner Library, which is a beautiful, airy, sunlit place to go and do your daydreaming or your journal writing or your studying or what have you, um, as well as Sanborn. Would you say creative writing is more imaginative teaching, or is it more logistical, or maybe a mesh of both? I think it is the logistics of the imagination. So I suppose one in the support of the other. Um, we all have a habit of making things up about ourselves and other people. And the difference with a fiction writer is that we just take it a lot farther. Um, we get carried away, if you will. We go into greater detail. We think about all of the kinds of things that other people might think about, but they don't bother to write down. Uh, they might just say to themselves, "Oh, I got that wrong," and sort of let go of whatever elaborate story they had created about a particular situation. The thing that's different with a fiction writer is a fiction writer takes that elaborate scenario and keeps it in a notebook, turning it into a draft, turning it into a story or a novel. Um, it's it's an interesting way of thinking about the world. I think something that is often lost on people when they are thinking about fiction writing is that it is a mode of intellectual inquiry, a way of taking on how we think about the world, how people live inside of systems, economic systems, political systems, social systems. It is a way of assessing um, the implications of how the world is changing, how the world did change, how the world might still change. It's part of why, for example, the Newcomb Institute created the Speculative Fiction Prize that exists now, which is something that I helped set up, and which is, I believe, still ongoing. At the time, uh, Professor Rockmore, uh, who heads that up, he was interested in the idea of the contest precisely because of the way he felt people writing science fiction and speculative fiction could predict the future, if you will, act as kinds of oracles into how we are all going to live uh, even as soon as next year. Um, and I think that's a really fascinating interrelationship between the kind of work he does, which is more science-based, and the kind of work that I do, which is not. Do you have any pieces of advice for students who are interested in majoring in English, writing, and literature? I would say at this juncture, something that I see a lot is, we have classes that cover in the English department that cover some of the basics, and a lot of students will tend to put those off until just before they graduate, the idea that there's some sort of onerous obligation. Those can be courses on Shakespeare or the Victorian novel. Excuse me, those are actually a lot of fun. And so I would say my advice is, if you're interested in majoring in those, is to consider taking those kind of broad historical period courses earlier than later, because you'll find maybe more about what you're looking for than you might guess. I had the good fortune when I arrived at Dartmouth of inheriting the office of an early modernist, which is what we call people who work on Shakespeare, and this particular professor had moved out and left behind books that he was going to have a bookstore in town come and take away. And I actually stopped him and I said, please leave those for me, because I wanted that library, which felt like this sort of weird and incredible gift. These books that were from an expertise that I didn't have, by a senior colleague who was not going to return to them, and yet had a store of knowledge that I actually was looking forward to searching around in. And that kind of, it's not quite a Felix culpa, but it is a kind of lucky gift. That sort of thing is the kind of thing I'm talking about when I'm talking about taking these courses. Like, what do you think you know about this era of literature that you might be wrong about? Can you challenge that? Can you challenge yourself to try finding your way through something like Chaucer, when you have always maybe thought that you couldn't take Old English seriously? That kind of thing. How does Dartmouth prepare students for a career in journalism? Do many English majors go into careers in journalism? I do teach journalism there. Jeff Charlotte is certainly part of that. He's a teacher. There are a number of applications. A really long tradition at the college, and have produced a lot of writers who are working journalists now. People who have jobs at the Atlantic. One who is now the head of, I think his title is the head of voice at Twitter. We've also, I would say it's a mix of things like the kinds of journalistic assignments you learn to write in Jeff Charlotte's class, and then also the kinds of things you would do for the student publications. Jeff, like me, likes to mentor his students into finding the kinds of graduate degrees, future careers that will help them make their way into the world. And we do everything from helping students to network, working with them on their application manuscripts, telling them how to apply for those grants and opportunities, to the coursework itself. So if you are interested in coming to Dartmouth and you're thinking about journalism and taking it seriously, we take that seriously. I don't think, have I missed anything? I think we are.
You got them.
We are done.
And I'm aware of the time, so Professor Chia, I very much appreciate you going a bit over. And I hope everybody on the call enjoyed this. Just a couple of things. The professor mentioned Rembert Brown, the student who became the
Yes.
head of voice at Twitter. He wrote actually for a sports and culture website called Grantland, and then also was actually on the plane with President Obama as they flew to Selma for that historic day, marching across the bridge. And you can actually read about Rembert in the most recent issue of 3D. I actually dropped the link to 3D in the chat a bit ago. And he is a fantastic writer and an interesting person as well. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank especially the professor, and then just encourage everyone. The professor also mentioned just the real value in taking a class in something like Shakespeare, and it just so happens that on Tuesday, April 27th, we have Professor Matthew Ritker, who I believe teaches a Shakespeare course. He will be presenting at 7 o'clock. Just want to check here. Yes, on Tuesday, April 27th. So I hope everyone can check that out as well. Tomorrow night, I think we have Professor Eugene Korzinski and collaborative creativity, design thinking, and brainstorming. And that should be a really good session as well. So thank you again, Professor Chi. Thank everyone for joining us. And I hope that you have a great evening or morning or day, depending on where you're tuning in from. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Thanks so much, everyone.